A cowboy doesn't freeze because the creek is cold. He freezes because of what he finds standing in it. Rancher Samuel Cross had been checking fence lines for 10 hours straight, sun beating down, back aching, throat dry as dust. All he wanted was a sip of cold water before heading back to an empty house and another silent supper. Then he heard it. A splashing sound, too loud for a deer, too steady for a cow. He pulled his horse up short, peering through the cottonwoods. His land. His water. No one was supposed to be here. And that's when he saw her. The breath snagged in his lungs. A woman, waist deep in the creek, her back to him. But this was no ordinary woman. She was a titan. Her shoulders were as broad as a barn door, muscles coiling in her arms like thick ropes of bronze in the dying light. His horse shifted, the leather creaked, and the giant woman froze. She turned, slow as a sunrise, water streaming from her hair. Samuel felt the world drop out from under him. Her face was beautiful, carved from granite and sorrow, with eyes that held 1,000 untold stories. But her size. Dear Lord, her size. She had to be well over 6 feet tall, built strong enough to wrestle a bear and win. He was staring at the mail-order bride the whole territory was laughing about. The one Benjamin Torres had taken one look at and sent packing. The one the boys at the saloon called a freak of nature. She started moving toward the bank, trying to cover herself, hunching her powerful shoulders to seem smaller. An impossible task. She moved with the shame of someone who had spent their whole life being told they were too much. Wait. The word slipped out before he could stop it. She paused, water swirling around her thighs, arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes, full of hurt but burning with a defiant fire, locked onto his. "This your land?" she asked. Samuel could only nod. His mind was spinning, trying to connect the town gossip with the magnificent wounded creature standing before him. "You're her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The bride from back east." Her face turned to stone. Was for about 5 minutes. She climbed out of the water, and in the last rays of sunlight, the droplets on her skin looked like scattered diamonds. She was terrifying. She was glorious. And the proud way she held her head, even with shame burning in her cheeks, twisted something deep inside Samuel's hollow chest. She reached for her clothes, her movements quick, efficient. "I'll be moving on come morning. Won't trouble you again." "Where?" The question surprised them both. She glanced up, her dress half on. Does it matter? And the strange thing was, it did. It mattered more than anything had in 3 long years. He'd grown used to the silence of his ranch, the emptiness left behind when the fever took his Mary, but the sight of this woman, dripping and defiant, made that silence feel like a tomb. "Name's Samuel Cross," he said, swinging down from his horse. "This is my ranch." "Rebecca Hayes," she said, her fingers flying on the buttons of her dress. "And I know what you're thinking." Her laugh was a broken thing. Same thing they all think. That God made a mistake when he made me. Samuel looked at the pain carved into her face, deep as a canyon. "What I'm thinking," he said slowly, "is that you look like you could use a hot meal and a roof over your head." A flicker of something. Disbelief? Hope? Crossed her face before she stamped it out. "You don't know me. Don't have to," he said. "Cold is cold. Hunger is hunger." She was quiet for a long time, the only sounds the gurgle of the creek and the distant cry of a coyote. "One night," she said finally. "Just one." Samuel nodded, but something in his gut screamed that one night wouldn't be nearly enough. As they rode toward the ranch house, her solid warmth pressed against his back, Samuel felt the cold loneliness of his life closing in. This woman was a force of nature. She was real and alive in a way that made his empty house feel like a ghost town. But then they crested the ridge. The ranch spread out below them, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. It wasn't a sound of wonder. It was a sound of pure fear. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, but her hands tightened on his waist like a vice. "It's just, beautiful things don't usually last for someone like me." And Samuel realized he hadn't just invited a lonely woman into his home. He'd invited in a storm. And that storm had a secret she was terrified he would uncover. The ranch house was small, built for a man of average height and his delicate, petite wife. As Rebecca ducked under the main doorway, Samuel saw his home through her eyes for the first time. It was a cage of low beams and narrow halls, a constant reminder that she didn't fit. She stood just inside the door, her hands clasped, afraid to move, afraid to touch anything. When she stepped toward the stove to help with coffee, her shoulder brushed a hanging pot, sending it clanging against the wall. "Sorry," she whispered, her face flooding with color. It wasn't the pot that bothered him. It was the apology. How many times had she been forced to say sorry for simply existing? "Rebecca," he said gently. "Sit down." She lowered herself into the chair by the table, and it groaned under her weight. She shot up as if scalded, her face a mask of humiliation. "It's fine," Samuel said quickly. "That chair's held bigger cowboys than you." It was a lie, but it made her sit back down, her hands trembling in her lap. As he made the coffee, he watched her in the firelight. The harsh lines of her face softened, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the sheer force of will that kept her standing. "How long you been alone?" she asked, her voice quiet. 3 years, he said, placing a cup in front of her. He watched her large, capable hands wrap around the tin mug, making it look like a child's toy. "Since my wife, Mary, died." "Fever." "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "What about you?" he asked. "Any family?" Her laugh was bitter. "A father who drank himself to death and a mother who followed him. The church ladies decided I was too big for factory work, said I needed a husband, someone strong enough to handle me." She said the words like she was a piece of difficult livestock. 3 men, she continued, staring into her coffee. 3 different mail order arrangements. Each one took one look and shipped me back like faulty goods. The last one, Mr. Torres, he didn't even let me step off the stagecoach. "Their loss," Samuel said, and the words felt truer than anything he'd said in years. She looked up, her eyes scanning his face for the mockery that always came. Finding none, she seemed to sag a little. "You don't know what it's like, Samuel. Being too much, too tall, too strong, too everything for any man to want." "You know what I see when I look at you?" he asked, leaning forward. "A freak," she whispered. "Strength," he said, the word hanging in the air between them. "I see someone who could work beside a man, not behind him. Someone who wouldn't shatter the first time a harsh wind blew." Rebecca's breath hitched. "You don't mean that." "I do. This frontier. It breaks people. It broke my Mary. She was delicate. Too delicate for this life." He stopped, the old guilt twisting in his gut. The fever hadn't been the only thing that took her. The loneliness, the harshness of it all. He hadn't been strong enough to protect her from it. "I should go," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice cracking. "This is cruel. You being kind, getting my hopes up." Samuel stood and moved around the table. He reached out and gently touched her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "What if this time it's different?" he asked. "It's never different," she whispered, a tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "Maybe God didn't make a mistake with you, Rebecca. Maybe he was just making someone strong enough for a man like me. Someone who wouldn't break." "You don't understand," she cried softly. "I'm not what men want. I'm not soft or small or—" "You're not what they wanted," Samuel interrupted, his voice firm. "But you might be exactly what I need." She stared at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying, fragile hope. But then a shadow crossed her face, a darkness he hadn't seen before. "You think you know what happened with those other men?" she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling tone. "You think they just sent me away?" "What are you saying?" Samuel asked, a cold knot forming in his stomach. She pulled her hand back, her eyes suddenly hard as steel. "Mr. Torres wasn't just cruel, Samuel. He was interested. Too interested. He didn't send me away because I was too big. He sent me away because I fought back." The air in the room went cold. The crackling fire seemed to die down. Samuel looked at this powerful woman, at the raw strength in her arms, and the darkness that now swirled in her eyes, and he understood. Benjamin Torres wasn't just a man who'd rejected her. He was a man who had tried to break her, and he had failed. And Samuel had a sickening feeling that Torres wasn't the kind of man who took failure well. Rebecca wasn't just running from loneliness, she was running from him. And by bringing her here, Samuel hadn't just offered her shelter, he had painted a target on his own back. The next morning, an unspoken tension hung in the air. Rebecca moved around his kitchen with a fierce efficiency, making breakfast, her movements economical and powerful. But the vulnerability from the night before was gone, replaced by a guarded wall. Samuel watched her, his mind replaying her chilling words. "He sent me away because I fought back." "What did you do, Rebecca?" he asked quietly as they sat down to eat. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. She met his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "What I had to." He had a fine-looking walking cane with a silver handle. It's not so fine-looking anymore. Neither is his face. A cold respect washed over Samuel. He'd seen Benjamin Torres in town, a wealthy, arrogant man who treated everyone like they were beneath him, a man who always got what he wanted. "He'll come looking for you," Samuel stated. It wasn't a question. "I know," she said, her fork scraping against the plate. "That's why I have to leave. Today. I've brought enough trouble to your door already. And go where? To a lumber camp full of men just like him, only poorer and more desperate? No. Samuel, you don't owe me anything." He slammed his hand on the table, making the plates jump. "That's where you're wrong. For 3 years, I've been a ghost on this ranch, going through the motions, my Mary. She was supposed to be my partner. But this land was too much for her. It swallowed her whole. I watched her fade away long before the fever ever came. I failed her." His confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. "I can't fail again. This ranch needs a fighter. It needs someone strong. It needs you, Rebecca." "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice wary. "A job?" "I'm proposing a partnership," he said, his voice dropping. "In every sense of the word. We work this land together. We build it into something that can't be broken. And if Torres comes, we face him together." "You're crazy," she breathed. "The town will crucify you for taking in a woman like me. A violent woman." "Let them," Samuel growled. "I'm done living for the opinions of sheep." He stood up and walked to her, taking her large, work-roughened hands in his. They were calloused and strong, but they trembled. "I'm not promising you an easy life, Rebecca. I'm promising you a life where you don't have to fight alone. A place where your strength is a blessing, not a curse." Tears welled in her eyes, but these weren't the tears of shame he'd seen before. They were tears of shock, of a hope so fierce it hurt. "The town will never accept us," she whispered. "Then we'll build a world they can't touch," he said. Outside, the sky was clear, but Samuel could feel the storm coming. It had a name, and that name was Benjamin Torres. He knew that by making this offer, by choosing to stand with this incredible, dangerous woman, he was declaring war. He looked at Rebecca, at the fire in her eyes, and he knew it was a war he was willing to fight. "Yes," she whispered, a single word that sealed their fates. The fragile peace of their new partnership lasted exactly 2 weeks. They fell into a rhythm, working side by side from sunup to sundown. Rebecca was a force of nature. She could mend a fence faster than any man he'd ever hired, lift hay bales that made other men grunt, and had an instinct for livestock that was uncanny. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread instead of stale loneliness, but the shadow of Benjamin Torres loomed over them. Every rider on the horizon, every unexpected noise in the night, made them both jump. The inevitable confrontation came on a Sunday. They rode into town for supplies, a united front. The moment they stepped into the general store, a hush fell over the room. Every eye fixed on Rebecca, a mixture of awe and disgust on their faces. Samuel felt her tense beside him, ready to retreat into her shell of shame. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent declaration. "We stand together." "Well, I'll be." Samuel Cross. The voice was slick with venom. Benjamin Torres stood by the counter, impeccably dressed, a cruel smirk on his face. A fresh, ugly scar ran from his temple down his cheek, a stark white line against his tanned skin. "I see you found my lost property," Torres said, his eyes raking over Rebecca with possessive insolence. "She's not property," Samuel said, his voice dangerously low. "She's my partner." A ripple of shock went through the store. Torres let out a cold laugh. "Partner? Don't be a fool, Cross. That thing is an animal, untamable. I tried to teach it some manners, and it repaid me with this." He gestured to the scar on his face. "You'd be wise to put it on a leash before it turns on you, too." Rebecca flinched as if struck. The whispers in the store grew louder. "The only animal I see here," Samuel said, stepping in front of Rebecca, "is the snake who preys on women he thinks can't fight back. You just happened to pick one who could." Torres's face darkened with rage. "You'll regret this, Cross. I own this town. I'll see to it that no one sells you so much as a nail. I'll starve you out. I'll ruin you. And when you're broken, I'll be back for what's mine." He took a step closer, his eyes locking on Rebecca. "I always finish what I start." Then, something happened that no one expected. Rebecca, who had been hiding behind Samuel, stepped forward. She was a good head taller than Torres, her presence utterly commanding. "The only way you'll ever touch me again, Benjamin," she said, her voice clear and cold as a winter river, "is over his dead body." The store was dead silent. Torres stared at her, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. He had expected a cowering, shamed creature. He was not prepared for this avenging angel. He backed away, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he snarled, before turning and storming out of the store. The silence he left behind was deafening. Everyone stared at them, not with mockery now, but with a dawning, grudging respect. Samuel turned to Rebecca, his heart pounding. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, but she was holding her head high. The shame was gone, replaced by a warrior's pride. But as they gathered their supplies, the store owner, Mrs. Patterson, pulled Samuel aside. "You be careful, Samuel," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Benjamin Torres is a powerful man, but he's not the only problem. His cousin is Sheriff Miller. The law in this county belongs to them. You haven't just made an enemy. You've made an enemy who wears a badge." Samuel's blood ran cold. He looked over at Rebecca, who was standing guard by the door, her eyes scanning the street. They weren't just fighting a man anymore. They were fighting the law itself. The ride home was silent and heavy. The confrontation in the store had changed everything. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was a physical presence, breathing down their necks. Torres wasn't just a bully, he was a man with power, with the law in his pocket. That night, they sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill of fear. "This is my fight," Rebecca said, her voice strained. "You should send me away, Samuel, before he destroys everything you've built, and let him win? Let him think he can threaten and control people and get away with it? No, this is our fight now." But he's the law. Then the law is wrong, Samuel said fiercely. He stood and began to pace. For 3 years, I let this ranch slide. I let my life slide. I was afraid. Afraid of living after Mary died. Afraid of failing again. But you've woken me up, Rebecca. I'm not afraid of Torres. I'm not afraid of his crooked sheriff. The only thing I'm afraid of is losing this. Losing you. He stopped in front of her, his eyes blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not at her size or her strength, but at the brave, wounded soul inside. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. It was insane. It was reckless. It was the only thing that made sense. Rebecca Hayes, he said, his voice shaking slightly. There's only one way to show Torres, to show this whole town, that you belong here, with me, that we are a unit they cannot break. He dropped to one knee on the rough-hewn floorboards of the house his first wife had died in. Will you marry me? The world stopped. The fire crackled, oblivious to the momentous question hanging in the air. Rebecca stared at him, her beautiful face a canvas of shock, disbelief, and a fragile, terrifying hope. This wasn't a proposal born of convenience or partnership. She could see it in his eyes. This was real. This lonely, grieving man was offering her not just his name and his protection, but his heart. Samuel. You don't have to do this, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. This is just to protect me. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Marrying you isn't about protecting you, Rebecca. It's about saving myself. You make me brave. You make this empty house a home. I don't want to face Benjamin Torres without you. I don't want to face another sunrise without you. Tears streamed freely down her face, washing away the years of pain and loneliness. She had been called a monster, a freak, an animal. But this man, this good and broken man, was calling her his salvation. She reached out, her large hand gently touching his scarred cheek. Yes, Samuel, she breathed. Yes. I'll marry you. He rose and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She wrapped her powerful arms around him, holding him tight. And for the first time in either of their lives, they both felt completely and utterly safe. But as they held each other, a floorboard creaked in the dark hallway behind them. They both froze. They weren't alone in the house. Samuel spun around, pushing Rebecca behind him, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows by the back door. A man stepped into the firelight. It wasn't Torres. It was a wiry, older man, his face weathered and grim, holding a shotgun leveled right at Samuel's chest. Evening, Cross, the man said, his voice raspy. Name's Jedediah. I used to work for your father. Knew your first wife, too. Sweet girl. Too good for this world. Jedediah? What are you doing here? Samuel asked, his mind racing. He hadn't seen the old ranch hand in years. Heard you took in some. Company? Jedediah said, his eyes flicking to Rebecca. Heard you were angering Mr. Torres. That's a fool's game, son. A fool's game. We can handle Torres, Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. The old man shook his head slowly. It ain't Torres you need to worry about tonight. He sent me. But not for the reason you think. What reason? Rebecca demanded, her voice a low growl. He gestured with the shotgun toward the window, which looked out over the dark valley. He wants you to watch. He wants you to see what happens to people who defy him. Samuel and Rebecca rushed to the window, their hearts pounding. In the distance, a single point of orange light blossomed against the dark ridge. Then another, and another. The fires were on the northern edge of his property, where the winter hay was stored, their entire supply for the coming cold months. It's a warning, Jedediah said from behind them. Torres is burning you out. He wants you weak and broken by the first snow. Then he'll come for her, and he won't be alone. But then Jedediah did something unexpected. He lowered the shotgun. I'm an old man, he said, his voice filled with a weary sadness. I've done things I ain't proud of to survive in this town, but I knew your father, and I ain't gonna stand by and watch that snake destroy his son's legacy. He just paid me to deliver a message. He didn't say I couldn't deliver one of my own. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, tossing it onto the table. That's Torres's ledger, he said. He's been running a protection racket on the smaller ranches for years. Extortion. Blackmail. It's all in there. Names, dates, amounts. His cousin, the sheriff, gets a cut of everything. This is the weapon you need. It's proof. Why are you doing this? Samuel asked, stunned. Because I saw the look on your face in the store today, son. The way you stood up for this woman. It reminded me of a man I used to be, before this town broke me. He looked at Rebecca, a hint of awe in his old eyes. Maybe you two are strong enough to unbreak it. He tipped his hat and slipped back out the door, disappearing into the night as silently as he'd arrived. Samuel and Rebecca stood in stunned silence, the smell of their burning hay drifting in through the open door. They had lost their winter supply. They were facing starvation and a brutal winter. But on the table between them lay a weapon, a book filled with secrets that could bring down the two most powerful men in the county. Their enemy had made a fatal mistake. He thought he was burning them down. But he had just given them the fire they needed to fight back. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. As the last of their hay barns smoldered against the night sky, a cold, hard resolve settled over Samuel and Rebecca. They had been pushed, and now they were going to push back. We can't go to the sheriff, Rebecca said, her hand resting on the ledger. He's part of it. No, Samuel agreed, his mind working furiously. We go over his head. The territorial marshal, he's based in Cheyenne. It's a 3-day ride if we push it. One of us has to go, the other has to stay and guard the ranch, Rebecca stated, looking at Samuel. You should go, you're faster on a horse, and leave you here alone? Torres could come back at any time. No, we go together, and leave the ranch to be picked clean. They'll steal every head of cattle we have left. They stood at an impasse, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They were trapped. If they stayed, they'd be cornered and destroyed. If they split up, they'd be vulnerable. If they went together, they'd lose everything they were fighting for. Then Rebecca's eyes lit up with a dangerous idea. We don't have to go to the marshal, she said slowly. We can make the marshal come to us. How? Samuel asked. Torres's power comes from fear, she explained, her voice gaining strength. The other ranchers, the ones in this book, they're too scared to stand up to him. But what if they weren't? What if they knew they weren't alone? She was right. The ledger wasn't just a weapon against Torres. It was a rallying cry for his victims. The next day, they put their audacious plan into motion. While Rebecca stayed at the ranch, a rifle always within arm's reach, Samuel rode out. He didn't ride for Cheyenne. He rode to the small, scattered ranches mentioned in Torres's ledger. At the first ranch, belonging to a German immigrant named Schmidt, he was met with a slammed door. At the second, the owner threatened him with a pitchfork. Fear had a tight grip on these people. But at the third ranch, a small homestead run by a widow named Clara, something changed. Samuel laid the ledger on her kitchen table, showing her the entry with her name, the exorbitant protection fee she'd been forced to pay. He's a devil, she whispered, her hands trembling. He threatened my children. I know, Samuel said gently, but he can't threaten all of us. If we stand together, if we all send a wire to the marshal on the same day from every town in this county, he'll have to come. He can't ignore dozens of complaints of corruption against a sheriff. Hope, a fragile and dangerous thing, dawned in the widow's eyes. For 2 days, Samuel rode, showing the ledger, sharing the plan. He spoke of Rebecca's courage, of their stand against Torres. Slowly, cautiously, the tide began to turn. The ranchers, isolated in their fear, began to see a path to freedom. They agreed. On Saturday, at noon, the telegraph offices would be flooded with messages for the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. Samuel rode home, exhausted, but exhilarated. As he crested the ridge overlooking his valley, a wave of relief washed over him. The house was quiet, smoke curling from the chimney. Rebecca was safe. He burst through the door, a triumphant grin on his face. It worked! They're with us! But the sight that greeted him wiped the smile from his face. Rebecca was sitting at the table, her face pale. Across from her sat Sheriff Miller, Torres's cousin. He held a pistol in his hand, aimed lazily at Rebecca's heart. 2 of his deputies stood by the door, rifles ready. "Welcome home, Cross," the sheriff said with a greasy smile. "You've been a busy man. We were just having a chat with your wife-to-be. Seems she's got a bit of a history back east. A violent history." "What are you talking about?" Samuel snarled, his eyes darting to Rebecca. She wouldn't look at him. Shame radiated from her in waves. The sheriff chuckled. "Oh, she didn't tell you? Our Rebecca here wasn't just a mail-order bride. She was a runaway, fled a warrant for assault in Pennsylvania. Seems one of those other suitors of hers ended up in a hospital for 3 months. Tried to press charges, but she disappeared before they could serve the papers." Samuel stared at Rebecca, his mind reeling. Was this the secret she'd been hiding? The darkness he'd sensed? "Don't you see, Cross?" The sheriff continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She's a violent criminal, a menace. My cousin Ben was just trying to protect himself from this monster. Anything that happened, she brought on herself." He leaned forward, his smile turning predatory. "Now, I hear you found a little book. My cousin would like it back. Give it to me, and maybe I'll forget to wire the authorities in Pennsylvania about where to find their fugitive." Samuel was caught. He looked at Rebecca's bowed head, at the sheriff's smug face, at the deputies by the door. He had 2 choices: hand over the ledger and save the woman he loved from a prison sentence, condemning the entire county to Torres's tyranny, or refuse and watch Rebecca be dragged away in chains, her past finally catching up to her. He had walked right into a perfect trap, and the clock was ticking. It was Friday night. The telegrams were scheduled to be sent tomorrow at noon. The silence in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Miller's pistol remained steady, pointed at Rebecca. Her gaze was fixed on the floorboards, her powerful shoulders slumped in defeat. "The ledger, Cross," Miller repeated, his voice impatient, "or your woman hangs." Samuel's mind raced. He had believed in her story of self-defense. But the sheriff's words planted a seed of doubt. A warrant? A man hospitalized for 3 months? Had he been a fool? Had he fallen for a violent criminal who was just using him for protection? He looked at Rebecca, searching for an answer. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes met his. They were filled with shame, yes, but also a desperate plea, a plea for him to believe in her. And in that moment, Samuel made his choice. "You're lying," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. Miller's smile faltered. "Am I? Check her bag, the one she arrived with. I'm sure the warrant is tucked away in there. A little souvenir." Samuel's heart sank. He remembered her small, worn bag. It was still in the corner by the hearth. If he looked and the warrant was there, it was all over. If he didn't look, he was betting everything on faith. "I don't need to," Samuel said, taking a slow step forward. Whatever she did to survive. Just like all the people in that book. A flicker of admiration crossed Rebecca's face. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Wrong answer," he snarled, and cocked the hammer on his pistol. "Last chance, Cross. The ledger is hidden," Samuel lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. "If anything happens to us, the widow Clara has instructions to send it straight to the marshal. It was a bluff, but a good one." The sheriff hesitated. He couldn't risk the ledger getting out. "Fine," Miller said, lowering his pistol slightly. "We'll do this another way." He nodded to his deputies. "Tie them up. We'll wait here for Torres. He'll know how to get them to talk." The deputies moved in, binding Samuel's and Rebecca's hands behind their backs with rough rope. They were forced into chairs on opposite sides of the room, helpless prisoners in their own home. Miller settled in, confident and smug, to wait for his cousin. Hours passed. The fire died down to glowing embers. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock, each tick a countdown to noon, a deadline that now seemed impossible to meet. Samuel met Rebecca's eyes across the dim room. "I'm sorry," he mouthed silently. She just shook her head, a look of fierce, heartbreaking love in her eyes. It wasn't his fault. Then Samuel noticed something. One of the deputies, a young kid no older than 20, kept glancing at them. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with his rifle. Samuel recognized him. He was one of the ranch hands from the general store, the one who had wished them the best. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Benjamin Torres arrived. He strode into the cabin like he owned it, a cruel, triumphant smile on his scarred face. "Well, well," he said, circling Rebecca's chair like a vulture. "Look what we have here, the happy couple. Told you I finish what I start." He backhanded her across the face. Rebecca's head snapped back, but she didn't make a sound. She just glared at him, her eyes filled with pure hatred. "That's for my face," he hissed. "Now, for the ledger." "He's not going to tell you," she spat. "Oh, I think he will," Torres said, pulling a wicked-looking knife from his belt, "because he's going to watch while I carve a matching scar on your pretty face." He reached for her. Samuel strained against his ropes, a wordless roar of fury tearing from his throat. And that's when the young deputy made his move. "I can't," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't be a part of this." He swung the butt of his rifle, catching the other, more seasoned deputy squarely in the back of the head. The man went down like a sack of grain. Sheriff Miller spun around in shock, raising his pistol. But the young deputy was faster. He fired his rifle from the hip. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Miller cried out and crumpled to the floor, clutching a bloody leg. Torres froze, his knife held halfway to Rebecca's face. He was alone. His power, built on fear and a corrupt lawman, had evaporated in a single moment of courage. Samuel, using the distraction, threw his weight forward, crashing his chair into Torres's legs. Torres stumbled, and Rebecca surged up, her bonds straining. The cheap chair she was tied to splintered and broke under her immense strength. She was free. Torres scrambled back, his eyes wide with terror. He was face to face with the avenging angel he had tried to break, and this time there was no one to save him. The fight was short and brutal. Torres's knife was no match for Rebecca's raw power. She disarmed him with a single bone-jarring blow and threw him across the room like a rag doll. He landed in a heap by the hearth, whimpering. The young deputy, whose name was Billy, quickly cut Samuel's ropes. "The telegrams," Samuel gasped, looking at the clock. "It's almost noon." "You have to go," Rebecca said, standing over the cowering form of Benjamin Torres. "I'll handle things here." Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ledger, gave Rebecca a quick, desperate kiss, and ran for the barn. He rode like a madman, his horse's hooves thundering against the dry earth. He burst into the telegraph office at 5 minutes to noon, the ledger clutched in his hand. The office was empty. His heart sank. Had he failed? Just then, the door opened. The widow Clara came in. Then the German, Schmidt. Then 2 more ranchers, then 3 more. They had come themselves to make sure the message was sent. Exactly at noon, the telegraph key began to click. One after another, messages of corruption and extortion, all naming Sheriff Miller and Benjamin Torres, flew across the wires to Cheyenne. The dam of fear had broken. A flood of justice was coming. When the U.S. Marshal and his deputies rode into town 3 days later, they found a strange sight. Sheriff Miller was locked in his own jail cell, his leg crudely splinted. Benjamin Torres was in the cell next to him, bruised and bandaged. The young deputy, Billy, was nervously holding the keys, while Rebecca Hayes stood guard on the porch, a rifle resting comfortably in the crook of her arm. The ledger told the marshal everything he needed to know. The town's reign of terror was over. The investigation also turned up the truth of Rebecca's past. The man in Pennsylvania had been the abusive factory foreman who had cornered her. The warrant was real, but so was her claim of self-defense, with multiple other factory girls coming forward as witnesses now that he was exposed. The warrant was dropped. A month later, Samuel and Rebecca stood before the town preacher. The whole valley was there. The widow Clara stood as Rebecca's maid of honor, and the young ex-deputy Billy, now Samuel's new ranch foreman, stood as his best man. As they said their vows, Samuel looked at his bride. She was magnificent, strong, and beautiful. She was no mistake. She was a miracle, forged in hardship and pain, sent to save him from himself. He had been a man living in a house of ghosts, afraid of his own shadow. She had been a woman who thought her strength was a curse, that she was too much for this world. But together, they were just right. They had faced down evil, freed a town, and built a love as strong and resilient as the mountains that surrounded their ranch. They had made their own acceptance. Behind them, the town buzzed with a new legend, not about a freak and a fool, but about a warrior queen and the man brave enough to love her. The story of two broken people who didn't just save each other, but saved everyone else too. As they rode home, husband and wife, Rebecca finally understood. She wasn't too big. She had just been waiting for a life big enough to hold her. If this story touched something deep in your heart, if it made you believe that courage is found in the most unexpected places and that everyone, no matter what the world tells them, deserves to be loved for exactly who they are, then your journey with us is just beginning. Hit that subscribe button right now. This channel isn't just about telling stories. It's about finding the truth in the tall tales, the strength in the struggle. We bring you stories every week that remind you that the world's labels don't define you. Your heart does. Your courage does. When you join our community and hit that notification bell, you're saying yes to stories that matter. Stories that prove that monsters are just people the world hasn't taken the time to understand. Stories that show that one or two brave souls standing together can topple an empire of fear. Someone out there needs to hear this. Someone who feels too big, too different, too broken. They need to know that their perceived flaws are actually their greatest strengths, just waiting for the right moment, the right person, to be revealed. So subscribe now, share this story, because when we share stories of courage, we create more of it in the world. And next week, we'll be back with another story that will prove, once again, that love is always the most powerful weapon against the dark. Don't miss it. Your heart will thank you.